Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The moon hung like a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, its light too thin, too cold to offer any real warmth. Down in the hollow, the pack gathered around the great bonfire, its flames clawing at the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine, and the acrid tang of pack sweat. I stood at the edge of the circle, where the shadows were deepest, where I belonged. Tonight was the night of the first hunt. The night I turned 21, but there would be no celebration for me. For the daughter of shame, there was only ever the periphery, the cold draft that curled around the edges of the pack's warmth. My existence was a constant, dull ache, a reminder of a story told in hushed whispers, the faithless rogue who had sired me and vanished, leaving my mother and me to bear the weight of his abandonment. Aveline Morath. The name itself felt like a whisper, easily lost in the wind. I drew my threadbare cloak tighter, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chill of 100 pairs of eyes, some filled with pity, most with contempt. My mother, Alara, stood a few feet away, her shoulders perpetually slumped, as if carrying the burden of our shared disgrace. She had taught me to be invisible, to keep my head down and my gaze lowered. To survive, she said, we had to be less than ghosts. We had to be nothing. But tonight, a strange fire was building under my skin, a restless energy that felt like a gathering storm. It was the moon, the turning of my age, the primal call that every true-born wolf felt. But for me, it felt like a curse about to bloom. The alpha, Kael, a brood of a wolf whose authority was measured in scars and intimidation, raised a hand for silence. The low-timbered growls and jostling laughter died away. "Tonight," he boomed, his voice a gravelly roar that scraped against my nerves. "We honor the moon, we honor the blood, we honor the strength of the Blackwood pack." A chorus of howls answered him, a symphony of power and belonging that I could never join. My throat was always tight. My own wolf, a silent, shivering thing, locked deep inside me. I was wolfless, they whispered. Barren. A broken branch on the pack's great tree. Kael's gaze swept the circle, and for a terrifying moment it landed on me. His lip curled in a sneer. "And we cast out weakness." The words were a physical blow. I flinched, my eyes stinging. Beside me, Lyra, the alpha's favored female, smirked. Her scent was sharp, like burnt sugar and malice. "Look at her," she murmured to her friends, her voice just loud enough to carry. The little rogue blood, still waiting for a father who never wanted her, still waiting for a wolf that will never come. Her laughter was like shattered glass. My mother took a half step towards me, her hand fluttering as if to shield me, but she knew better. Any defense would only make it worse. So I did what I always did. I bowed my head, letting my dark hair fall like a curtain, and endured it. I focused on the strange, insistent burning on my left shoulder blade, a deep, cellular heat that was growing with every passing second. Something was coming. Something inevitable and terrible was about to break the surface of my miserable life. The humiliation was a familiar cloak, but tonight it felt different, thinner. The fire under my skin was spreading, a molten web tracing patterns I couldn't see. It coiled in my stomach, tightened around my heart, and made the blood sing in my ears, drowning out the pack's ritualistic chants. I stumbled back, a gasp escaping my lips as the pain sharpened from a dull burn to a searing brand. My vision swam, the firelight blurring into streaks of orange and gold. "Aveline?" My mother's voice was a frantic whisper, her hand finally finding my arm. Her touch was trembling. "It hurts," I managed to choke out, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. I rarely spoke. My voice was another thing the pack had tried to beat into silence. The pain was incandescent. It wasn't a wound. It was a remaking. a fire from within, scorching its way to the surface. I fell to my knees, my hands clawing at my tunic, trying to get to the source of the agony on my back. A collective gasp went through the pack. The ritual had stopped. Every eye was on me, no longer with pity or contempt, but with a dawning, predatory curiosity. Kael strode forward, his heavy boots crunching on the frosted leaves. "What is this? What new shame do you bring to us, girl?" I couldn't answer. A scream was trapped in my throat, a silent, agonizing shriek as the fire crested. It felt like 1,000 needles of pure moonlight were stitching a new reality into my flesh. Light, impossibly bright, erupted from beneath my tunic, casting the clearing in a ghostly white glow. My own skin was the source, a beacon of raw, untamed power. Through the haze of pain, I heard Lyra's hiss. "She's cursed, a demon!" But it wasn't a curse. It was something else, something ancient and true. As the light blazed, the pain began to recede, leaving behind a profound, throbbing ache, and something more. A connection, a tether to a presence so vast and powerful, it stole the air from my lungs. It was a scent of ozone and ancient stone, of storm clouds and a king's command. It was a name, whispered on the edge of my consciousness, a name I had no right to know. Draymon. The light faded. I was left kneeling in the dirt, panting, my body slick with sweat. The pack was silent, a wall of stunned, wary wolves. My mother knelt beside me, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it made my blood run cold. "Show us," Kael commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Show us the mark of your rogue father." With fumbling, shaking hands, my mother reached for the collar of my tunic. She pulled the rough fabric aside, baring my shoulder to the cold night air and the hungry eyes of the pack. Another gasp rippled through the crowd, this one laced with disbelief and fear. Even Kael took an involuntary step back, his alpha bravado momentarily shattered. I twisted my head, trying to see the source of their shock. I couldn't see the mark itself, but I could feel it. A raised, intricate pattern of lines and whorls, still radiating a phantom heat. My mother's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the cloth. "No," she breathed, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "It cannot be." It was the first time I had ever seen true fear in her eyes, not the weary resignation of an outcast, but the stark animal terror of someone whose carefully constructed world had just been set ablaze. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice raw. "Mother, what is it?" She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the mark, on the truth now seared into my skin for all to see. Kael found his voice first. It was no longer booming with authority, but tight with a dread I didn't understand. That is not the mark of some nameless rogue. That is the royal sigil." He stared at me, his amber eyes wide with horror and a dawning, terrible understanding. "The dragon's crest, the mark of the Alpha King." The world tilted. The sounds of the forest, the crackling fire, the breathing of the pack, it all faded into a distant roar. The Alpha King, King Korvath Draymon. A figure of myth and terror, a ruler so powerful his name was only ever spoken in a hushed, fearful tones. He was a king of 1,000 packs, the wolf who answered to no one but the moon itself. He was a ghost story told to frighten pups. He was not supposed to be real, and his mark was on my skin. The lie I had been fed my entire life, the story of my shameful rogue father, crumbled into dust. This mark wasn't a brand of abandonment. It was a brand of lineage, of power, of a truth so monumental, it felt like it would tear me apart. My father hadn't abandoned me. The silence of the clearing was broken by the splintering of wood. I looked towards our small hovel at the edge of the territory and saw the door hanging off its hinges. Standing in the doorway were 2 figures, cloaked in black, their forms radiating a cold, lethal stillness that made every wolf in the clearing lower their heads in submission. Their scent hit me like a physical blow, cold steel, mountain air, and the unmistakable, overwhelming musk of the royal bloodline. The king's personal guard, the Shadow Claws, they moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made Kael look like a clumsy pup. They ignored the pack, their glowing silver eyes fixed solely on me. One of them, a tall male with a face like carved granite and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, took a step forward. He looked from my shocked face to the still glowing sigil on my shoulder. His voice was devoid of all emotion, as cold and final as a winter grave. "Aveline Morath, by the blood of the moon and the decree of the Alpha King, you are summoned. Your hiding is over." The clearing was frozen in a tableau of fear. The world I knew, the jeers, the bonfire, the oppressive weight of Kyle's authority, had fractured into a million silent pieces. The two shadow claws stood like statues carved from night and winter, their presence sucking all the warmth from the air. The pack, which only moments ago had felt like a suffocating force of nature, was now a ring of frightened animals, their bravado stripped away, their heads bowed not in respect, but in primal submission. "No," my mother whispered, the word a ragged, desperate plea. She scrambled forward, falling to her knees before the scarred guard. "Please, you don't understand. She is no one. A simple girl, sickly, weak. She is not what you think." The guard, whose silver eyes held the cold emptiness of a winter sky, looked down at her. He did not sneer. He did not show pity. He showed nothing at all. "We are what the king commands," he said, his voice the sound of grinding stone. "And he commands his daughter's return. Stand aside, Alara." He knew her name. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a chance discovery. This was a reckoning. My entire life, my mother's careful construction of our pathetic, peripheral existence, it had all been a lie built on a foundation of deeper lies. The guard's gaze flicked to me. "Aveline Morath, you will come with us." It was not a request. I was still on my knees, the phantom heat of the sigil on my shoulder a constant, terrifying reminder of the new skin I wore. My mind was a whirlwind of betrayal and confusion. I looked at my mother, crumpled on the ground, her face a mask of shattered truths. Was her fear for me, or for herself? All those years of endured shame, of teaching me to be small and silent, was it protection, or was it a cage? Before I could process the thought, the second guard moved. He was at my side in a blink, his touch surprisingly gentle as he helped me to my feet. My legs felt like water. I swayed, and his grip tightened on my arm, a steady, unyielding anchor in the chaos. "Her things," I heard myself say, the voice thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. "I need—" The scarred guard, who I now knew was their leader, cut me off. "You will need nothing from this place." The finality in his tone was absolute. He was severing my past with a single sentence. I took one last look around the clearing. Lyra's face was pale with shock, her usual malice replaced by a wide-eyed awe that was almost as insulting as her hatred. Kyle stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. The Alpha of Blackwood, a tyrant in his small kingdom, was utterly powerless. I saw it in his eyes, the dawning horror that the nameless, wolfless Omega he had tormented for years was now so far beyond his reach, she might as well have been a goddess of the moon. My gaze landed on my mother one last time. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw an ocean of unspoken words, of fear and regret so profound it stole my breath. She opened her mouth as if to say something, a warning, an apology, a final lie. But no sound came out. Then the guards turned, and I was swept along between them, leaving my mother, the pack, and the only life I had ever known behind, in the flickering firelight. We moved through the forest with an unnatural speed and silence. My clumsy human steps struggled to keep up with their lupine grace. The world became a blur of dark trees and silver moonlight. The sounds of the pack faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the forest floor. The journey was a long, silent crucible. The guards did not speak, to me or to each other. Their silence was a wall, offering no answers, no comfort. It gave me time to think, and my thoughts were a tempest. My father, a king. The words didn't fit together. The father I had imagined was a faceless rogue, a creature of impulse and fleeting passion. I had hated that phantom for leaving us, for branding me with his shame. But a king. Kings did not simply forget. They did not abandon. They acted with purpose. The shame I had carried my entire life felt suddenly hollow, a costume I had been forced to wear. Beneath it, anger began to smolder. a deep, cold rage directed at my mother. She had let me believe I was worthless. She had nurtured my humiliation, encouraged my invisibility. Every whispered insult, every shove in the dirt, every lonely night spent feeling like a mistake. She had allowed it all. For what? We traveled through the night and into the gray, misty hours of dawn. Just as my exhaustion reached its peak, we emerged from the tree line onto a high, windswept ridge. And I saw it. It wasn't a castle of gleaming spires and fluttering banners. It was a fortress, a jagged shard of black rock that seemed to have been torn from the mountain's heart and thrust into the sky. Dramehold. It was more a part of the landscape than something built upon it. A place of raw, brutal power. High walls of dark, volcanic stone were patched with iron, and a single massive gate of scorched blackwood stood closed like a stubborn mouth. No guards were visible on the ramparts, yet I felt hundreds of eyes on us. The air itself was different here, thin, cold, and charged with an ancient predatory energy. It smelled of ozone, granite, and old blood. As we approached, the colossal gate swung inward without a sound, opening into a vast, torchlit courtyard. The space was filled with wolves, dozens of them, moving with a silent, disciplined purpose that was nothing like the chaotic jostling of the Blackwood pack. These were warriors. Their scents were sharp and clean, their bodies honed into weapons. As we passed, they stopped their tasks, their heads turning in unison. They did not stare or whisper. They simply watched, their eyes, many of them the same startling silver as my escorts, assessing me with an unnerving stillness. I felt like a field mouse brought into a den of lions. The scarred guard, Rorik, I finally learned his name was, led me from the courtyard into the main keep. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin soles of my boots. We walked through cavernous halls hung with faded tapestries depicting great hunts and ancient battles. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, beeswax, and something else. Something wild and masculine that made the nascent wolf inside me stir restlessly. Finally, we stood before a set of iron-bound doors, each one carved with the snarling visage of a dragon-like wolf. Rorik placed a hand on the door. He turned to me, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than duty crossed his face. It might have been pity. The king sees few. He speaks to fewer still. Do not expect warmth, girl. The king's heart is a fortress even colder than these walls. He paused, his silver eyes boring into mine. But blood calls to blood, remember that. He pushed the doors open. The room beyond was not a grand hall, but a throne room made of shadow and power. The only light came from a high arched window that framed the gray dawn sky, and from a huge crackling hearth to my right. The light played over worn stone floors and walls of dark polished wood. At the far end of the room, on a dais of 3 stone steps, sat a throne. It was not made of gold or silver, but carved from a single massive piece of obsidian, its surface seeming to drink the light from the room. And on the throne sat the king. He was not a man sitting on a throne. He was the mountain the throne was carved from. King Corvath Draymond was larger than any wolf I had ever seen, his shoulders a bulwark against the world, his frame filling the great chair with an absolute, immovable presence. His hair was the color of a storm cloud, shot through with threads of silver that caught the firelight. His face was a harsh landscape of sharp angles and old scars, one of which cut from his temple down across his cheekbone, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent, faint snarl. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were the same startling silver as his guards, but they were not empty. They were ancient, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to be the source of all the shadows in the room. He did not move. He simply watched me as I was led to the foot of the dais, his gaze a physical weight, pinning me in place. The overwhelming scent I had noticed in the halls, ozone, winter, and the coppery tang of old blood, poured off him in waves. This was my father. The guards bowed low and retreated, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing silence, standing before the myth, the monster, the king. My father. I didn't know what to do. Should I kneel? Should I speak? My throat was a knot of dry dust. All the anger I had felt on the journey, all the questions, they evaporated under the intensity of his gaze. I felt like a child again, small and insignificant. He broke the silence. His voice was not a roar, but a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and up into my bones. So the lie is finally undone. I flinched at the words. It was not a greeting, it was an indictment. I found a sliver of my earlier anger and clung to it like a shield. You knew, I whispered, my voice trembling. You knew where I was all this time. I have known where you were every second of every day for 21 years, he rumbled, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I have watched you from afar, seen your shame, your solitude, the casual cruelty of it. The admission that he had witnessed my suffering and done nothing broke through my fear. Why, I demanded, my voice gaining a desperate strength. Why would you leave me there, to be mocked, to be called wolfless, to be nothing? For the first time he moved. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. The sorrow in his eyes was eclipsed by a flash of something fierce, something akin to agony. Because nothing was safe, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Because Nameless was a shield. Because the daughter of a rogue is pitied. The daughter of the Alpha King is hunted. He rose from the throne. The sheer scale of him was terrifying. He was a giant, a primal force of nature. He descended the steps slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone. He stopped just before me, close enough that I had to crane my neck to see his face, close enough that his scent was a suffocating cloak. You think your life was a lie to hide you from shame? He asked, his voice a low guttural snarl that vibrated in my chest. No, child, it was a cage. A cage to hide your scent, to mask your blood, to keep you from the notice of our enemies. He reached out, his large calloused hand hovering just over my shoulder, over the mark that had changed everything. I could feel the heat of his palm, the raw power thrumming just beneath his skin. That sigil, he breathed, his silver eyes locking onto mine, filled with a grim, terrible finality. It is more than the mark of my blood. It is a beacon, and the moon has just shattered your cage and lit the flame for all the world to see. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and cold as iron chains. Hunted. The word echoed in the sudden ringing silence of my mind, pushing aside 21 years of ingrained shame and replacing it with a terror so pure and sharp it was almost a relief. Shame was a slow poison. This was the clean, cold blade of a knife at my throat. I stared up at the vast, granite-faced man who was my father, and for the first time, I saw the truth of him not as a king, but as a warden. Dreamhold was not his palace, it was his fortress, and I was its newest, most precious prisoner. Who? The question was a breath, a ghost of a sound, but in the echoing chamber, it was as loud as a scream. Who hunts me? Korvath's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek pulling his mouth into a deeper snarl. He looked away from me, his silver gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the great hearth. They have many names, the Forsworn, the Carrion Council, old bloodlines who believe the dragon's crest belongs to them. They have been watching my line for centuries, waiting for a moment of weakness, a break in the succession. He finally looked back at me, and the sorrow in his eyes was a raw, open wound. They have been waiting for you. The anger I had clung to dissolved into a fine, cold ash. This was a burden he had carried alone, a secret war fought in the shadows. My mother's lie, her desperate attempt to make me invisible, was not a betrayal. It was a shield, a fragile, flawed shield that had just been shattered by the moon itself. My mother, I whispered, the name tasting of guilt on my tongue. She knew. She knew the price of my blood, he corrected, his voice a low rumble of ancient pain. She chose a life of shame for you over a death sentence, a choice I permitted. He took a step back, the space between us widening again, the brief, almost intimate moment of his explanation vanishing. The king was back, the fortress walls of his heart slamming shut. That choice is no longer viable. Your power, dormant for 2 decades, has announced itself. The scent of my blood is now on you, a perfume for assassins and usurpers. You are no longer Avalyn Morath, the outcast. You are Avalyn Draymon, the target. He turned and strode back to his obsidian throne, the very air seeming to bend around his authority. He did not sit. He stood before it, a dark silhouette against the gray morning light. He raised a hand, and as if from the stone itself, Rorik, the scarred guard, materialized at the doorway. "Take her to the North Tower," the king commanded, his voice once again stripped of all emotion. "See that she is bathed and clothed. Post the silver guard on her door. No one enters or leaves without my express command. No one." The finality was absolute. I was dismissed, a problem to be managed, a treasure to be locked away. Rorik bowed his head. "Yes, my king." He gestured for me to follow, his face as impassive as ever. I stood frozen for a moment, my gaze locked on my father's back. I wanted to scream 1,000 questions at him, to rage against the injustice of a life spent in one cage only to be thrown into another. But I was still the girl from the Blackwood pack. I knew how to be silent. I knew how to obey. I turned and followed Rorik from the throne room, the heavy doors closing behind us with a boom that sealed my fate. The walk to the North Tower was a journey through the heart of Dramhold's power. We passed training yards where wolves sparred with a brutal, silent efficiency, their movements a blur of lethal grace. We walked through armories where the air smelled of whetstone and steel, and libraries where ancient leather-bound tomes were chained to the shelves like sleeping beasts. Everywhere there were the silver-eyed Draymond warriors. They moved with a purpose that bordered on fanaticism, their loyalty to the king a palpable force in the air. They watched me pass, their gazes curious but disciplined. I was an anomaly, a secret brought into the light, and they were the keepers of the secrets. I felt no warmth from them, no sense of kinship. I was not one of them. I was merely the king's blood, a living symbol to be protected. The North Tower was the most isolated spire of the fortress, connected to the main keep by a stone bridge that arched over a dizzying drop. The wind howled here, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to speak of long winters and endless solitude. Rorik led me up a winding staircase, the air growing colder with each step. At the top, 2 guards stood sentinel, their armor etched with silver runes, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. They were the Silver Guard, the king's personal elite. Their eyes glowed with a faint inner light, and they looked at me as if I were a fragile, priceless artifact. Rorik spoke a quiet word to them, and the heavy iron-strap door swung open. He gestured for me to enter. "Your needs will be provided for," he said, his tone flat. "Do not try to leave." He closed the door, and the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place echoed in the sudden silence. The room, or rather, the suite of rooms, was stark but beautiful. It was a cage of silver and smoke. The walls were pale gray stone, softened by thick tapestries depicting winter landscapes, snow-laden pines and frozen rivers under a full moon. A large bed was covered in heavy furs of silver and white wolf pelts. A fire was already roaring in a stone fireplace, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill in my bones. An arched window, latticed with iron but containing no glass, looked out over the endless, jagged peaks of the mountains. There was no sign of the world below, only sky and stone, no escape. On a wooden chest at the foot of the bed were neatly folded clothes, a simple tunic of soft gray wool, dark leggings, and supple leather boots. They were the clothes of the keep, practical and severe. My old patched tunic and worn-out shoes lay in a heap on the floor where I had stepped out of them, a pathetic reminder of a life that already felt a lifetime away. A door I hadn't noticed opened, and a woman entered. She was tall and lean, with a braid of white blonde hair so long it reached her waist. Her eyes were the color of chips of ice, and she carried herself with the stiff posture of a warrior. "I am Sorsha," she said, her voice crisp and cool. "I am assigned to you. The king has ordered a bath prepared." She pointed to another door, from which steam was now curling. I said nothing, just nodded. I felt numb, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by forces I couldn't comprehend. Sorsha's icy gaze missed nothing. She watched me as I walked towards the bathing chamber, her eyes lingering for a moment on the sigil on my shoulder, which was visible through a tear in my old tunic. Her expression was unreadable. Was it reverence for the king's mark, or resentment for the disruption my arrival had caused? The bath was a deep copper tub filled with steaming, herb-scented water. As I sank into its heat, the weariness of the past day and night washed over me. I scrubbed my skin raw, trying to wash away the scent of the Blackwood pack, the lingering smell of shame and wood smoke, but I could not wash away the mark. It tingled under the hot water, a permanent part of me now, a declaration of who and what I was. When I emerged, dressed in the clean, severe clothes, I felt erased. The girl who had knelt in the dirt, branded by humiliation, was gone, but the woman who stood in her place was a stranger, her reflection in the polished surface of a silver mirror unfamiliar. My face was pale, my eyes wide and dark with shock, my long dark hair a stark contrast to the pale wool of the tunic. Saoirse was waiting for me. "The king will send your meal," she said, her tone implying this was a great honor. She then turned and left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me alone in the vast, silent suite. I walked to the window, the wind a cold caress on my face. The sheer, brutal beauty of the mountain range was terrifying. It was a world of stone and sky, a fortress built by nature itself. I was as trapped here as I had been in the Blackwood. The bars of this cage were just farther apart and far more beautiful. Hours passed. The sky outside the window shifted from gray to a bruised purple as evening approached. A tray of food had been left silently inside my door: roasted meat, dark bread, sharp cheese, but I had no appetite. My stomach was a tight knot of fear and confusion. Just as darkness consumed the last of the light, the heavy bolt on my door slid back. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't Saoirse or Rorik. It was the king. He entered the room, and it immediately felt smaller, the air thicker. He carried no torch, but the firelight seemed to cling to him, casting his immense form in flickering shadows. In his hand, he held a small object. He stopped in the center of the room, his presence dominating the space. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching me, his silver eyes searching my face. "You have your mother's eyes," he said at last, his voice a low, rough thing, softer than it had been in the throne room. "She hated these mountains. She said they stole the sky." He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a small, exquisitely carved wolf, whittled from a piece of pale birch wood. It was captured mid-howl, its head thrown back, its tiny form filled with a wild, yearning spirit. "She made this for you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was fighting to control. "The night before she left Dramehold, she said you should have something of the wild to hold on to, even if you could never run with it." My breath hitched. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the small wolf. The wood was smooth, worn with the passage of time. To know that my mother, in her last moments in this place, had been thinking of me, carving a piece of her hope and her sorrow into this small object. It was a blow to the heart. I looked up at my father, and the mask of the cold, unfeeling king was gone. In its place was a man drowning in a sea of grief, a man who had made an impossible choice and had been living with its consequences for 2 decades. The fortress walls around his heart had a crack in them, and through it, I saw a flicker of the man my mother must have loved. "Why did she leave?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "If you loved her, why?" The crack sealed. The sorrow was consumed by a grim darkness. "Love is a luxury a king cannot afford. Her presence here was a danger to you both." He took a step back, his face becoming a mask of stone once more. "And the danger is not just from without, Aveline." His sudden shift in tone sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" He looked towards the door, then back at me, his silver eyes burning with a cold, urgent fire. "This keep is old. Its loyalties are a tangled root system, and some of those roots are poisoned. My mark on you has stirred a nest of vipers who have slept for a long time. They will smile at you. They will call you princess. They will offer you kindness." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Trust none of them. The shadows in this fortress have teeth, and some of the most dangerous whisper my name as they sharpen their knives." The king's warning was a poison that seeped into the silence of my tower room. After he left, the luxurious furs on the bed felt like a snare, the roaring fire a cage of light. I spent the night pacing the cold stone floor, the small wooden wolf clutched in my hand, its smooth, carved surface the only tangible link to a past that was now a tangled tapestry of love and lies. "The shadows in this fortress have teeth." The words coiled around my heart, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I had spent my life fearing the open contempt of the Blackwood pack. Now I was meant to fear honeyed words and deferential smiles. It was a new and far more terrifying kind of wilderness. Sleep was a distant shore I could not reach. Every creak of the ancient tower, every mournful howl of the wind, was a footstep in the dark, the whisper of a sharpened knife. I felt a strange, restless energy thrumming just beneath my skin. It was the echo of the sigil's birth, a phantom limb of power I didn't know how to command. For the first time, I felt the presence of my wolf, not as an absence, but as a sleeping beast deep within me, its dreams filled with moonlight and the scent of blood. It was stirring, awakened by the call of my new reality, and it was as frightened and confused as I was. When dawn painted the mountaintops in hues of rose and steel, Saoirse entered without knocking. Her icy eyes swept over my sleepless form, my pacing, the untouched tray of food from the night before. She did not comment. "The king has commanded your presence," she stated, her voice as crisp as the morning air. "The Elder Council has been convened to officially acknowledge the heir." The viper's nest. My blood ran cold. "Acknowledge me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Or test me?" A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Saoirse's stoic features before being instantly suppressed. "They are one and the same, my lady," she said, her use of the title feeling like a deliberate, pointed barb. "You will wear these." She laid a new set of clothes on the bed. They were finer than the simple woolens, but no less severe. A tunic, a dark, forest green velvet, so dark it was almost black, with a single, intricate silver clasp at the collar in the shape of the dragon's crest. There were fitted black leggings and tall boots of soft, silent leather. It was not the gown of a princess, but the garb of a warrior heir, a uniform, another skin I was being forced to wear. As I dressed, I felt a new resolve hardening within me. I may not have the strength of these Draymond wolves, or the cunning of their politicians, but I had survived 21 years of being nothing. I had learned to watch, to listen, to see the truth behind the sneers and the false pity. I knew how to be still and silent. Perhaps that was a weapon in itself. Saoirse led me from the tower. The fortress was alive, a humming hive of deadly purpose. We descended into the heart of the keep, to a section I had not seen before. The walls here were older, the stone darker, almost black. The air was heavy with the weight of history, of secrets kept and judgments passed. The guards we passed were not the Silver Guard, but hulking warriors clad in dark iron, their faces grim and unreadable. They watched me with an intensity that felt like a physical pressure, their gazes a mixture of awe for my bloodline and suspicion of my foreignness. We stopped before a pair of ancient oak doors, bound in black iron, and guarded by two of these formidable sentinels. Saoirse did not enter with me. She simply gave a curt nod. "The king awaits." The guards pulled the heavy doors open, and I stepped inside. The council chamber was circular, a stone rotunda with no windows. The only light came from a single great brazier in the center of the room, its flames casting long, dancing shadows up the walls. Seated in high-backed carved stone chairs were the elders. There were 5 of them, 4 men and 1 woman, their faces a gallery of ancient power and cunning. At the head of the circle, on a seat only slightly larger than the others, sat my father. He was a mountain of silent authority, his silver eyes fixed on me as I entered, his expression unreadable. I walked to the center of the room, stopping a few feet from the brazier. The heat was a stark contrast to the chill in my veins. The silence was absolute, a living thing that pressed in on me from all sides. I met their gazes one by one. There was an old man with a long white beard, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind a web of wrinkles. There was a woman, her hair the color of polished silver, her face a beautiful but cruel mask of aristocratic disdain. Each of them radiated an aura of power, of bloodlines as old as the mountains. The old man, Lord Valerius, spoke first, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that did nothing to hide the steel beneath. "So the lost daughter returns, an unexpected complication in the king's line." His words were polite, but his scent was sharp with challenge. "There is no complication, Valerius," my father's voice boomed, the sound vibrating through the stone. "There is only the truth, written in blood by the moon herself. You have been summoned to bear witness to it." The silver-haired woman, Lady Seraphina, gave a delicate, dismissive sniff. "A truth hidden for 2 decades amongst outcasts and lesser packs. Forgive our caution, my king. Blood can be thinned by such unfortunate associations." The insult was clear. I felt a flush of the old shame, the familiar heat of humiliation. But then I felt something else, a low, dangerous growl vibrating deep in my own chest. It was my wolf, stirring in its sleep, enraged by the slight against our blood. I clamped down on the sound, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept my gaze level and my face a blank mask, just as my mother had taught me. I did not speak. I waited. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst would have. They exchanged glances, their scrutiny intensifying. They were dissecting me, searching for weakness, for the scent of the omega they expected to find. It was then that I felt it. A new presence. Someone was standing in the shadows, just beyond the circle of chairs, his form obscured by the pillars that lined the room. I hadn't seen him enter. He made no sound, but his stillness was more potent than any movement. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze on me, a heavy, burning intensity that was entirely different from the cold assessments of the elders. It wasn't a political gaze, it was primal. The council continued their probing. They asked about the Blackwood pack, about my mother, about the moment the sigil burned itself onto my skin. I answered their questions with the simple, unadorned truth, my voice quiet but steady. I gave them nothing to use, no emotion to twist, no fear to exploit. All the while I was acutely aware of the man in the shadows. A scent began to cut through the stale, smoky air of the chamber. Pine needles after a storm, cold river stone, and wild, untamed wolf. It was a scent of the outside, of the true wilderness beyond these fortress walls. It called to the sleeping beast within me, a low, resonant note that made my own blood hum in response. Lord Valerius leaned forward, his eyes glinting. She is silent. She is still. These are the traits of an Omega, King Corvath, not a Draymon heir. An heir of the dragon's crest must have fire, not just obedience. Before my father could respond, the figure stepped out from the shadows. He was not as large as my father, but he was built with a lean, predatory grace that spoke of speed and lethal force. His hair was black as a raven's wing, tied back from a face that was all harsh angles and savage beauty. A jagged scar ran from his hairline down to his jaw, puckering the skin near his left eye, but it was his eyes that seized my attention. They were not the silver of the royal line. They were the color of molten gold, the incandescent, burning eyes of a hunter. He wore no finery, only black leather armor that looked as though it had seen 100 battles. This was the source of the wild scent, the silent, intense gaze. He moved to stand behind my father's chair, a silent guardian, but his golden eyes never left mine. The elders stirred, their discomfort palpable. This man was not one of them, yet his presence commanded a grudging respect that bordered on fear. Lord Valerius's sneer faltered. Lord Riker, we did not realize you were attending this private council. I go where the king's interests are threatened, the man, Riker said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp, like stones grinding together in a deep riverbed. And I hear the words of a man who has forgotten that obedience is the foundation of all strength. A lesson a politician would do well to remember. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Valerius paled slightly, sinking back into his chair. Riker's gaze returned to me, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between us. In his eyes, I saw no pity, no reverence for my bloodline, no political calculation. I saw recognition. He was not looking at a lost princess or a former Omega. He was looking at a wolf. He saw the beast I was only just beginning to feel, and he was not afraid of it. He was challenging it. A spark ignited in the space between us, a current of silent, primal communication that had nothing to do with words. It was a question and an answer, a clash of wills that left me breathless. My father's voice cut through the tension. Enough! You have borne witness. The blood is true. The heir is acknowledged. He rose to his feet, a clear dismissal. Aveline, you will return to your chambers. As I turned to leave, my path took me past Riker. The air around him was electric, the scent of pine and wild earth so strong it made my head spin. I kept my eyes forward, but I felt his gaze follow me, a physical touch against my skin. Just as I drew level with him, his voice came. A whisper so low it was meant only for me, a secret spoken in the space between heartbeats. The cage has changed, little wolf, he rasped, his golden eyes burning into the side of my face. But the scent of the wild is still on you. They can smell it, too. Riker's whisper followed me back to the tower, a ghost of a sound that was more real than the heavy tread of the guards at my door. The cage has changed, little wolf, but the scent of the wild is still on you. Back in the silver and smoke confines of my room, I paced like a trapped animal, the velvet of my new tunic feeling alien against my skin. The words were a key and a curse. He was the first person here, the first person in my entire life, who had looked at me and seen a wolf, not a victim. He saw the wildness I felt thrumming under my skin, the same restlessness that my mother must have felt before she fled these stone walls. He had acknowledged the very part of me I was only just beginning to discover, and in doing so, he had validated its existence. But his words were also a warning. They can smell it too, the elders. Lady Seraphina with her eyes like chips of ice, Lord Valerius with his honeyed venom. They had been sniffing the air around me, not for the scent of royal blood, but for the scent of the untamed thing they could not control. They saw my silence not as obedience, but as the stillness of a predator, and it made them afraid. And fear, I knew from my life in the Blackwood, was the mother of cruelty. I went to the iron-latticed window, pressing my face against the cold metal, letting the fierce mountain wind whip my hair. The air here was thin and pure, smelling of snow and stone. It was a clean scent, an honest scent, unlike the perfumed lies of the council chamber. I breathed it in, trying to find the trace of pine and river stone that clung to Riker, but it was gone, lost to the vastness of the fortress. The rest of the day passed in a suspended silence. Saoirse brought my meals, her movements as precise and emotionless as ever. She never spoke unless I addressed her first, and her icy blue eyes seemed to miss nothing. She was the perfect jailer, her presence a constant, silent reminder of my confinement. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock at my door, a soft, almost tentative sound that was utterly different from the authoritative rap of a guard. Saoirse opened it to reveal Lady Seraphina. She stood there, draped in a gown of shimmering silver that made her look like a queen of winter, a polite, cold smile gracing her lips. "My dear Evelyn," she said, her voice like chilled wine, "I hope I am not intruding. I thought, after the formality of the council, you might appreciate a friendly face, a kinswoman's welcome." Saoirse looked to me, her eyebrow raised in a silent question. I gave a small nod, my heart beginning to hammer a wary rhythm against my ribs. The shadows in this fortress have teeth. Seraphina swept into the room, her movements a study in aristocratic grace. Her scent filled the space, a cloying cloud of night-blooming flowers, and something else, something sharp and metallic, like cold silver. "This tower," she said, her gaze flicking around the room with a look of faint distaste. "The king is protective, but it must be terribly lonely for you up here, so far from everything." She was fishing, her words the delicate bait on a very sharp hook. I remembered my father's warning, "They will offer you kindness." "The king has his reasons," I replied, my voice quiet. I gestured to one of the carved wooden chairs near the fire. "Please." She sat, arranging her silver skirts around her. "Of course, the king always has his reasons." There was a subtle edge to her tone, a hint of dissent polished to a high shine. "We were all so surprised, after all these years, to discover an heir living in such circumstances. It must have been dreadful for you." Her eyes held a look of manufactured pity. "I survived," I said simply, her smile tightened. "Yes, you did. That is what is so remarkable." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You must not let the grimness of this place overwhelm you. Dramehold is a fortress, and my cousin the king is its stone heart. He feels things, I am sure, but he has forgotten how to show them. He surrounds himself with savages." The word hung in the air. I knew instantly who she meant. "Lord Riker, for instance," she continued, as if reading my thoughts. "The king's hound, useful on a battlefield, I suppose, but hardly a suitable influence for the heir to the throne. He is of the wild packs from the Broken Teeth Mountains, barely civilized. Do not mistake his position for true standing. He is a weapon, nothing more." She was trying to isolate me, to drive a wedge between me and the one person who had not looked at me like a political problem. She was painting Riker as a beast, a feral creature beneath my station, and by extension, she was reminding me of my own wild origins. "He seemed loyal to my father," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh, his loyalty is absolute," Serafina agreed with a dismissive wave of her hand. "The loyalty of a dog to its master. But a dog is still a dog, my dear. You are a Draymon. Your blood is the blood of kings, not mountain savages. You must remember that." She stood, her visit apparently concluded. From a fold in her sleeve, she produced a small, velvet-wrapped object. "A small gift, to welcome you to the family properly." She unwrapped it to reveal a necklace. It was a delicate, exquisitely crafted thing of woven silver strands, with a single, perfect moonstone resting in the center. It was beautiful, but as she held it out to me, all I could see was a collar, a pretty silver collar to replace the invisible one of shame I had worn for so long. "Thank you, my lady," I said, taking it. The metal was cold against my palm. "Please call me Serafina," she insisted, her smile finally reaching her eyes, but the warmth there was as false as a painted fire. "We are family, after all." She glided to the door, pausing on the threshold. "If you should ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands the subtleties of this court, my door is always open." Then she was gone, leaving behind the lingering scent of her perfume and the chill of her veiled threats. I stood there for a long moment, the silver necklace clutched in my fist. She hadn't come to welcome me. She had come to measure me, to see if I was a pawn she could manipulate or a threat she needed to neutralize. A wave of suffocating frustration washed over me. I felt the stone walls closing in, the polite, venomous whispers of the court, a more effective prison than any locked door. I needed air. I needed to escape the cloying scent of Serafina's lies. I went back to the window, my eyes drawn to the courtyard far below. The training yards were mostly empty now, as dusk began to settle over the mountains, but not entirely empty. One figure moved in the center of the largest yard, a solitary shape against the gray flagstones. Riker. He was stripped to the waist, his leather breeches and boots stark against his skin. The fading light caught the intricate tattoos that snaked across his back and down his arms, patterns that spoke of tribes and battles I couldn't imagine. He held two long curved blades, and he moved not like a man practicing drills, but like a storm given human form. It wasn't a dance. It was a prayer to violence. Every turn, every slash, every impossible leap was executed with a fluid, lethal grace that made the Draymon warriors I'd seen earlier look like clumsy children. He was not just wielding the blades. He was part of them, an extension of the whistling, deadly steel. I watched, mesmerized. This was the wildness Serafina scorned. This was the savage she dismissed as a dog. But I saw no mindless beast. I saw a being perfectly in tune with his own power, a creature of discipline and deadly intent. The wind was picking up, and even from this distance, I imagined I could smell the scent of his exertion, sweat and steel and that clean, wild scent of pine. My own wolf, the quiet, sleeping thing within me, stirred again. It watched through my eyes, and it recognized him. It felt a strange, resonant pull towards the raw, untamed power he embodied. He was everything this cold stone fortress was not. He spun, the twin blades a blur of silver, and then froze, perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. I held my breath. It was impossible. He couldn't have heard me. He couldn't have sensed me from so far away. Slowly, as if guided by some unseen force, he lifted his head. His golden eyes, glowing like embers in the twilight, found me in the high window of the north tower. They locked with mine. The distance between us collapsed. The wind, the stone, the fading light, it all fell away. There was only the silent, burning intensity of his gaze. It was a raw, unfiltered connection that bypassed words and went straight to the heart of the wolf within me. I saw in his eyes the challenge from the council chamber, but there was something else now, too. A flicker of understanding, a shared recognition of what it was to be a wild thing in a cage of stone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat answering the call in his eyes. I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks, a feeling so new and strange I couldn't name it. My hand, which still clutched the silver necklace, tightened so hard I felt the delicate links dig into my skin. A shadow fell over me, A deep, rumbling voice spoke directly behind me, so close I jumped, startled out of my trance. "He is not for you to watch." I spun around. My father stood there, a towering silhouette against the firelight of my room. His face was a mask of thunder, his silver eyes not on me, but fixed on the scene below, on the solitary, feral figure of his warlord. When his gaze finally fell to mine, it was as hard and cold as the obsidian of his throne, and in its depths, I saw the possessive, dangerous fury of a king. The air in the room crackled, thick with a sudden, suffocating pressure. My father's fury was a living thing, a storm of ozone and cold rage that dwarfed the simple heat of the fireplace. His words, "He is not for you to watch," were not a father's gentle chiding. They were the absolute territorial decree of a king. My brief, silent connection with Riker across the courtyard was not a harmless glance. It was an act of treason. "I was looking at the mountains," I lied, my voice small, the instinct to be invisible, to placate the alpha, roaring back to life from the depths of my Blackwood past. "Do not," he growled, taking a step closer, his immense shadow swallowing me whole. "Take me for the fools in your former pack. I saw where your gaze was fixed. I saw the look on your face." His silver eyes bored into me, filled with a glacial, possessive fire. "He is my weapon, Aveline, my hound. He is not a distraction for a girl who has yet to understand the throne she stands to inherit." The injustice of it was a slap. He had locked me in a tower, paraded me before a council of vipers, warned me that my life was a target, and now he was furious because my eyes had found the one creature in this entire fortress who looked at me and saw an equal. The nascent wolf inside me, the one that had been sleeping for 21 years, bristled. It did not want to cower. It wanted to snarl, and for the first time, I let it. "You brought me here," I said, my voice shaking but laced with a new, unfamiliar steel. "You branded me with your name and your power. You put me in this cage and told me to fear the shadows. Am I not even allowed to choose what I watch from my own window?" His eyes widened fractionally, a flicker of shock in their silver depths. He had expected the broken Omega. He had expected the cowed, silent girl. He was not prepared for the spark of the Draymond fire he himself had passed down to me. The anger in his face warred with a grim, almost painful flicker of pride. "You misunderstand the nature of your cage," he said, his voice losing its thunderous rage and taking on a low, dangerous gravity. "It is not to punish you. It is to prepare you. In 7 days, the first moon of the air will rise. It is an ancient rite, a crucible. The power of our bloodline will pour into you, and you must be strong enough to contain it. Your mind must be a fortress, your will a blade of forged steel. Any distraction, any wildness." He glanced dismissively toward the window, toward the yard where Riker had been. "Could shatter you. It could burn you out from the inside, leaving nothing but an empty shell for our enemies to claim." The truth of his fear, so much larger and more terrifying than simple jealousy, hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about controlling his daughter. This was about keeping his heir alive. The ritual was the reason for the urgency, the reason my awakening had thrown the fortress into a state of high alert. "You must be pure Draymond," he continued, his voice resonating with the weight of centuries of command. "Your focus must be on the blood, on the line, on the power that is your birthright and your burden. Riker is of the wild. His spirit is a storm. That is why he is a peerless warrior. And it is why his influence is a poison to you now. Do you understand?" I nodded, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a cold dread. I understood his logic. But my heart, the treacherous, newly awakened thing in my chest, did not care for logic. The connection I felt with Riker wasn't a distraction. It was an anchor. It was the only thing in this cold stone world that felt real. "I understand," I whispered. He seemed to accept my submission. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He looked at my hand, still clenched into a fist. "What is that?" Slowly I unfurled my fingers, revealing the delicate silver necklace from Seraphina, its moonstone gleaming palely in the firelight. A look of profound weariness crossed my father's face. "Her poison is prettier than Valerius's, but it is no less potent. She seeks to bind you to her, to make you a puppet in her games for influence. She will use your beauty, your name, your power, all for her own ends." He reached out, and with a surprising gentleness, he took the necklace from my palm. There is only one chain you will ever wear, Aveline, and it is the chain of duty that binds you to this throne. He tossed the necklace into the heart of the fire. The silver blackened and twisted for a moment before melting into a formless, glowing bead in the embers. The moonstone cracked with a faint pop. He turned and left without another word, the heavy bolt of the door sliding home behind him with a sound of utter finality. I was alone again, but the room felt different. It was charged with the echoes of his power, the weight of my destiny, and the ghost of Riker's wild spirit. I stared at the fire, at the spot where the beautiful, poisonous gift had been consumed. My father had saved me from one snare, only to tighten his own. But something inside me had broken loose during our confrontation. A small, fierce piece of my will. I would not be a passive pawn, waiting for a ritual to either make me or break me. I had to know. I had to understand the connection my father feared so much. I had to see Riker again, not as a distraction, as an answer. For 2 days, I was a model prisoner. I ate the food Sorsha brought. I wore the clothes laid out for me. I sat by the fire and stared into the flames, projecting an air of quiet contemplation. But all the while, I was watching Sorsha. She was my only link to the world outside this tower, my only hope. She was as cold and remote as the mountains, her loyalty to the king seemingly absolute. But I saw the small things. The way her eyes would sometimes drift to the window, a flicker of longing in their icy depths. The way she handled the hunting knives used to cut the bread and meat with a familiar, practiced grace that spoke of a life before this fortress. Serafina had called Riker a savage from the wild packs. Perhaps Sorsha was one, too. On the third night, I took the chance. Sorsha had come to collect my dinner tray. As she turned to leave, I spoke, my voice low. "The wind sounds different tonight." She paused at the door, her back to me. "It is the same wind as always, my lady." "No," I insisted softly. "It sounds like the forests of the Blackwood. It sounds trapped." She was still for a long moment. Then, without turning, she spoke, her voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. "All wild things are trapped here, my lady. Some cages are just larger than others." She left, bolting the door behind her. But this time, the sound of the bolt was not a sound of finality. It was the beginning of a conspiracy. The next night, she brought my meal as usual. As she set the tray down, her hand brushed mine. I felt a small, hard object pressed into my palm. I closed my hand around it, my heart leaping. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and in their gill depths, I saw a spark of rebellion. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before leaving. I waited until I was sure she was gone, then opened my hand. It was a key, old iron and heavy. Not for the main door, the silver guard stood there. For something else. I searched the room, my hands running over the cold stone walls, the heavy tapestries. Behind a tapestry depicting a winter hunt, my fingers found it. A small keyhole-shaped indentation in the stone, almost invisible in the mortar. My hands shook as I inserted the key. It turned with a low, grinding groan of disused metal. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase, thick with cobwebs and smelling of dust and cold stone. A servant's passage, long forgotten. A way out. My blood sang with a wild, terrifying thrill. I pulled on the dark leggings and tunic, the silent boots, and slipped into the darkness, pulling the secret door closed behind me. The passage was pitch black, and I descended by touch, one hand on the rough, cold wall. The air grew colder, and I could hear the distant sounds of the keep, a clatter of steel, a shouted order, the low hum of life. The passage ended at a heavy wooden door with a small Judas window. I peered through. It opened onto a deserted corridor in the lower levels of the keep, near the armories. I waited, listening, my senses stretched to their limit. When the corridor was clear, I slipped out. Now, I had to find him. Where would the king's hound be when not in the training yards? Not in the grand halls with the courtiers, somewhere quiet, somewhere he could breathe. I let a strange instinct guide me, a pull I couldn't explain. I followed the scent of the night air, climbing staircases that led to the outer battlements. I found him on the highest, most wind-blasted parapet of the fortress, a place that overlooked the sheer, dark drop of the mountain and the endless sea of stars above. The wind was a physical force here, tearing at my hair and clothes. He stood at the edge, staring out at the jagged peaks, a dark, solitary figure against the moonlit sky. He was not wearing his armor, only a simple black tunic and breeches. He was perfectly still, but it was the stillness of a predator at rest, every line of his body taut with contained power. He knew I was there, I was sure of it, but he did not turn. I walked slowly towards him, the wind stealing the sound of my footsteps. I stopped a few feet behind him. The scent of pine and storm was all around him, a clean, wild aura in the cold air. "The king has forbidden you from seeing me," I said, my voice nearly lost in the wind. He finally turned. His golden eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, capturing the faint starlight. The scar on his face was a pale line against his skin. "The king has forbidden you from seeing me," he corrected, his voice a low rasp. "He gave me no such orders. He knows I would not obey them." His defiance was a startling, breathtaking thing. "Why?" "Because my loyalty is to the throne, not to the king's fears." He studied my face, his gaze intense, searching. "Why did you come here, little wolf? To defy him or to ask a question?" "Both," I admitted, my voice gaining strength. "In the council chamber. You looked at me, not like the others." "They look at the king's daughter," he said, taking a step closer. The space between us hummed with a palpable energy. "I look at the wolf who survived 21 years in a fox trap. They see a symbol of power. I see a predator who has learned to wear the skin of prey. I know the scent of a cage, and I know the heart of the hunted." His words were a revelation, stripping away every layer of my fear and uncertainty, and leaving the raw, beating truth of me exposed. He saw me. He truly saw me. "My father believes your wildness is a danger to me," I whispered, the confession feeling like a betrayal. A humorless smile touched his lips. "Your father fears what he cannot control. He wants to forge you into a weapon of pure Draymond steel. He forgets that the strongest steel is quenched in the wildest storms." He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate. He did not touch my face or my hand. His fingers went to my shoulder, to the spot where the sigil burned beneath my tunic. I flinched, expecting the reverence or fear that everyone else showed the mark. But his touch was different. It was warm, firm, and possessive. A current of raw energy, a shock of molten heat, arced from his fingertips, through the cloth, and straight into the brand. The sigil blazed to life under my skin, not with pain, but with a blinding, ecstatic power. A silent howl ripped through my soul, the joyous, terrifying cry of my own wolf, finally fully awake. It recognized his touch. It answered his call. It knew him. This was not a meeting. It was a reunion. "What is this?" I gasped, stumbling back, my hand flying to my shoulder. The heat was incredible, a fire in my blood. Riker's golden eyes were wide, blazing with a dawning, terrible understanding. He stared at his hand as if it had betrayed him. "The first moon," he breathed, his voice rough with shock. "It is not just a trial of power, is it? It is a mating." Before I could process the cataclysmic weight of his words, a new scent drifted on the wind, cutting through the clean mountain air, the cloying, sweet smell of night-blooming flowers and cold ambition. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the battlement stairs. Lady Seraphina stood there, wrapped in a cloak of white fur, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her beautiful, cruel face. "Well, well," she purred, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "It seems the little lost wolf has already chosen her stray." Seraphina's voice, slick with triumph, cut through the wind. My blood ran ice cold, not with fear, but with a sudden, clarifying rage. The time for hiding, for being small and silent, was over. It had died the moment Riker's touch set my soul on fire. I did not pull away from him. Instead, I stood my ground, my eyes locked on the silver-haired woman who represented every lie, every whisper, every gilded cage I had ever been forced into. Riker moved, subtly shifting his stance to place himself between me and the new threat. A low growl, a vibration in his chest. But I placed a hand on his arm, the muscle beneath his tunic hard as stone. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying over the wind. This is not your fight to shield me from. It is my throne to defend." His golden eyes met mine, and in them I saw a storm of violent protectiveness warring with a dawning respect. He gave a single sharp nod and held his ground, a silent, lethal sentinel at my side. Seraphina's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by my lack of fear, but she recovered quickly, her expression hardening into one of righteous indignation. "So the little stray has a snarl after all. How disappointing. The king places his trust in you, secludes you for your own protection, and you sneak out like a common thief to rut with his dog on the battlements. He will be so very pleased to learn of your gratitude." She turned, her white fur cloak swirling around her like a shroud, clearly intending to go straight to my father, but another figure blocked the archway to the stairs, a figure so immense he seemed to be carved from the mountain's shadow. King Corvath. He stepped onto the parapet, his silver eyes taking in the scene with a terrifying, unreadable calm. He looked at me, at my hand still resting on Riker's arm. He looked at Riker, whose posture was one of coiled, deadly readiness, and he looked at Seraphina, whose face was a mask of triumphant malice. "My king," she purred, dropping into a low, graceful curtsy. "I am so sorry you had to see this. I came to check on the princess, and I found her, compromised." My father's gaze was heavy, a physical weight that threatened to crush me. The old fear, the instinct of the shamed Omega, tried to claw its way up my throat, begging me to explain, to apologize, to cower. I choked it down. I was Evelyn Draymond, and I would not kneel. "She speaks the truth, father," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "I came here to see him." Seraphina's eyes gleamed. She had won. Corvath's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek a livid white line in the moonlight. "You defied my command." "I defied your fear, Eka," I countered, taking a step forward, away from the safety of Riker's presence to face my father alone. "You saw a weakness, a distraction, but the moon, in its wisdom, showed me a strength you have long forgotten, the strength of a bond, of a mate." The word hung in the cold night air, a declaration of war and of destiny. Seraphina gasped, her eyes wide with shock and a furious, dawning realization that her plan was unraveling. My father stared at me, his face a mask of stone, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. He had suspected, feared this very thing. "You speak of a savage," Seraphina hissed, her voice losing its cultured edge and becoming sharp with desperation. "A half-breed hound from the wastelands. He is not a worthy consort for a Draymond heir. He will pollute the bloodline. He is the bloodline's salvation," I roared, the power of my own awakened wolf surging through me, a fire in my veins. My voice echoed off the stone, no longer the whisper of an outcast, but the command of an heir. "You see weakness in the wild, Lady Seraphina, because you have spent your life hiding in your gilded cage. You see savagery, where I see strength. You see a hound, where I see the heart of the hunt itself. My father's line is stone and shadow, Riker's is storm and fire, and the moon has decreed they will be forged together to create a dynasty that will never be broken." I turned my fiery gaze on my father. "You tried to shield me. You tried to forge me into your image, cold, solitary, and unbreakable. But you were wrong. Our strength is not in being a fortress. It is in being a fire that consumes all who threaten it." "And he," I said, turning and placing my hand flat against Riker's chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart, "is my flame." A profound silence descended on the parapet, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. My father looked from my defiant face to Riker's, whose golden eyes burned with an unwavering, absolute loyalty, not to the king, but to me. He looked at our hands, mine on Riker's chest, and he saw not a scandal, but a circuit of power, complete and undeniable. The weariness I had seen in him before returned, but this time it was different. It was the weariness of a long war finally ending. A slow, faint smile, the first I had ever seen, touched his lips. It was a grim, painful thing, but it was real. "For 21 years, he said, his voice a low rumble of awe and regret, I tried to hide the fire. I should have been feeding the flames." He turned his gaze to Seraphina, and the faint warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a winter so cold it could freeze blood. "You, cousin," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, You have lived in my court, eaten my food, and enjoyed my protection, all while sharpening your knives in the shadows. You saw my daughter not as blood, but as a weakness to be exploited. You sought to use her to wound me, to gain power. You have forgotten the first law of this fortress, the pack is all, and you have tried to poison the heart of this pack. Serafina paled, her arrogance crumbling into raw fear. My king, I was only thinking of the purity of the line. The line is stronger than it has been in 1,000 years, Corvath boomed, and you will not live to see its dawn. He raised a hand. From the shadows of the archway, 2 of the Silver Guard materialized. Escort the Lady Serafina to the black cells. She will await judgment for treason, and Lord Valerius with her. A viper is useless without its head. Serafina did not scream or beg. She simply went limp with defeat as the guards took her arms, her beautiful face a mask of shattered ambition. As they dragged her away, she looked back at me, her eyes filled with a pure, undiluted hatred that was almost a relief in its honesty. The parapet was silent again. It was just the 3 of us, the old king, the new heir, and her wild heart. My father walked to the edge, looking out at the mountains that had been his cage for so long. Your mother, he said, his voice thick with memory. She told me these mountains stole the sky, but she was wrong. They hold it up. He turned to face me, and the king was gone. In his place was my father, his eyes filled with a fierce, painful love. The first moon is in 3 days. The ritual will still be a crucible, but you will not face it alone. He looked at Riker. Protect her. She is the future. She is the dawn. He walked past us and was gone, leaving us alone under the vast, star-dusted sky. The wind whipped my hair around my face, but I no longer felt the cold. I was filled with a heat that came from my very core. Riker stepped towards me, his golden eyes searching my face. He slowly raised his hands and cupped my face, his calloused thumbs stroking my cheekbones. His touch was not rough, but achingly tender. Aveline Draymon, he rasped, his voice filled with a raw, wondering reverence. Air of fire and fury. You knew, I whispered, leaning into his warmth. You saw the wolf in me before I did. I saw the other half of my own soul, staring out from behind the bars of a cage, he said, his gaze intense. I have been waiting for you my entire life. I just didn't know it until I saw you. He lowered his head and his mouth met mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision of storm and stone, of wildness and royalty, of 2 solitary souls finding their true north. It was a claiming, a promise, and a beginning. The power of the sigil on my shoulder pulsed in time with my heart, a steady, triumphant beat. I was no longer the daughter of shame, nor the king's prisoner. I was the wolf who had found her mate, the heir who had claimed her fire. The cage was gone, melted away in the heat of my own power. Before me lay the mountains, the sky, and a future I would forge not in shadow, but in glorious, burning light. This was not the end of a story. It was the dawn.